This is a continuing line of research that started with a colleague of mine who's on the board of directors here at the Show Me Institute, Mike Podgorski, just trying to understand what was going on in the state of Missouri. So I can remember going into Mike's office probably 7 or 8 years ago and realizing that there's some lovely data that's produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis on the real value of goods and services, final goods and services produced at the state level. They used to not break it down by the state. You've heard of it as GDP. They control for inflation. Well, now they've broken it down to the state level. They've even broken it down to the metro area. So I can look at the St. Louis and Kansas City metro areas, Springfield, some of the other ones. But what started this was that Missouri has been growing slow. They've got, from 1997 to 2014, the average annual growth rate of the state economy, those final goods and services, has averaged 0.9%. Now, you could say, well, wait, there was a Great Recession that's probably driven everything down. Well, the Great Recession was countrywide, so all the states have done that. So let me just tell you what I mean by the relative issues that have shown up in Missouri. The relative issues that showed up here is that 0.9% ranks us 49th out of 50th in the fastest growing states in the United States. So something is going wrong here. We're not keeping up with our neighbors. We're not, and just let me tell you, the only state that's slower is, could you guess? Michigan. Michigan is the only one that's slower. So, so yeah, things are going awry, and we're trying to figure out why. So this morning is part of that ongoing line of research about what's going on. And in this case, we're going to look at a data set that is created by the Census Bureau that talks about establishments. So the census has a very clear idea of establishment. I can't create a consulting firm and simply say, I'm a new establishment. There has to be some sort of brick and mortar aspect to it. And the census has very well-defined ideas about what the establishment, what considers an establishment. Now, firms can have establishments, but if there's only one establishment, that coincides exactly with the firm. So this isn't the birth and death of firms, this is the birth and death of locations that are doing business in the economy. So this is really cool, because what goes on with this is that we've got data that goes, in this case, all the way back to 1977. So I told you about how slowly Missouri's been growing over the past couple of decades. We're going to look at birth and deaths of establishments that's evolved over 4 decades. So this goes back, as I said, 1977. So I've got 39, well, it's actually 36 years. It ends in 2013. And it just gives us some insight about what kinds of things are going on. So this is like a bathtub experiment, right? You fill up a bathtub by turning the spigot on. You drain the bathtub by opening up the drain. So we're going to be able to look at both sides of this. The birth part would be like the spigots, new establishments coming in, adds new jobs, should expand the economy. The drains are going to be those firms that exit or die. And so we're looking at the relative rates of those two eventually. But I'm going to ask this, you'll notice I asked this in a couple of ways, so it may turn your brain into thinking, well, there's something going on here. So I said, are newborn establishments the cure for Missouri? The other side of this, are keeping establishments from dying, is that the cure? So do we want to have policies that keep firms that are on their last leg, keep them from actually going out of existence? And then just a more general question, does the birth and death of these establishments, do they even matter? Does it matter in any sense of the word that we're going to do that? So we're going to be driven by questions, and we're going to I'm just going to present a series of slides, so you won't see a set of words here at all for a while. So here's the first one. This is state employment growth. These are alphabetical on the horizontal axis by state, so Missouri's always going to be in about the same spot. I'll give you some indicators here of what's going on. Now, by employment growth from 1977, we're 36th. So something happened between 1977 and 1997 where we were about in the middle of the country, probably. And then since 1997, we've been going downhill relative to the rest of the country. So, in terms of growth rates, so the vertical axis, think of this as being 0.01, if you can see that. I don't know if you can. It's just going to be 1%. We're growing a little bit faster than 1% in terms of employment across the state. Nevada is the one that's growing the fastest. It's averaged 4.5% over this 36-year period. So you can see all the rankings that are going on. So by employment growth, we're not one of the fastest, but we're not absolute towards the bottom like we are in terms of GDP growth. First chart this is going to be establishment. These are entry or births of new establishments by year. The aggregate number here, Missouri is actually going to be about 14th. So we're not so bad by having new establishments come in. And now this is the level. This is just the raw level of new establishments that come into the state of Missouri by state. So there's a picture there. It's a little over 10,000 new establishments in Missouri that have come in. Okay, and that's an average over this 36 years. So we seem to be creating new establishments at a pretty good clip.
Just an annual average?
Annual average, yeah. Everything I'm going to talk about is going to be an annual average from here on out. California is the big one.
Okay.
And you're going to see that's what's distorting this in a lot of things. I haven't controlled for state size. So I'm just going to report this by exit as well. So this is the rate, this is the total number of establishments that are exiting. Again, Missouri's somewhere in that top, this case around 22. Yes, sir.
Yes, okay, so the big line is California.
Big line is California.
If you go from left to right, the big lines, the big outliers, can you identify these states for us?
Well, they're going to be the big states. So here we've got California, what is? Florida. Dave knows this better than I do. So yeah.
New York and Texas.
New York and Texas. So these are not controlled for state size. Dave, can you read the rest of this?
No.
So, again, we see we're a little bit below, we're about average in terms of how quickly establishments are exiting the state of Missouri. Again, this is a level comparison. It's not anything that I want to make a big deal out of, because what I want to turn to rather is let's look at this establishment by rate. So now we are going to control for state size, and now you're going to see a sort of a great middling that's going on in terms of this kind of a return to the mean. So here Missouri is going to be in the high 20s. It's going to be that way for most of these from here on out. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the rate, that 10,000, the number of states, the number of establishments in Missouri, and divide it by the total number of establishments in the state. So now we're going to control for size that way. Instead of just doing raw numbers, we're going to get it that way. So Missouri seems to have about it's almost right at 12% is the rate at which establishments are created in this state on average each year.
Joe, would a proprietorship be one of these establishments?
As long as there's brick and mortar that goes with it. So if it's a sole proprietorship of someone who might be selling insurance, or it doesn't matter what category you're under in terms of how you file or what your business.
If they're working out of their home, it doesn't count.
If you're working out of your home, census doesn't identify that as being something that matters to them. Okay? So that's the establishment rate. And these are just pictures. I'm just kind of painting a broad picture. I'm going to get to more detailed analysis on this in just a second.
You do by rate, you did by the number of establishments.
That's right.
Does it change at all if you do it by population, or do you still get a relatively similar?
I haven't done that, so I can't answer that. My guess is it's not going to change things a whole lot, because establishment flows seem to be about where the population level is. So now this is the exit rate. Now Missouri's in the lower 20s here. I should say that we're below 25. I think 22 or 23. So this is the rate at which establishments are exiting the state each year on an average annual basis. So 12%. Just to give you a reminder, 12% was the rate at which we were entering new establishments. Here it's about 10.8%. So exit, at least by raw count, entry rates are faster than exit rates, so we should be growing. And that kind of is borne out in the data. We are growing, okay? This is job creation. Now the other thing that goes with this data set is how many new jobs are going to be associated with entering firms. So if you're a new establishment in the state, census goes in and says how many jobs were associated with this, and then this is divided by the total number of jobs that exist in the economy. So we've got a job creation rate by firms that are being birthed.
Is that right? The largest one is the District of Columbia?
No, I think the biggest one is Nevada again.
Nevada.
Yeah. just by a hair, but there's some big ones. Missouri's is in there. So we're getting new establishments. They're not creating a whole lot of jobs relative to the rest of the country in terms of the rate at which they're creating them.
I'm sorry, is that number the number of jobs that each establishment creates on average?
Not each establishment, it's there is a total number of establishments that are entering. Each establishment that's created creates a certain number of jobs. You total those number of jobs by entering establishments, and then divide that by the total number of jobs in the economy. Look, I think this data is fascinating, so don't hesitate to ask about the definitions.
So what does the 6 mean? Is it 6%?
Yes, 6%. No, 6%. It's a rate. Yeah.
6% per year.
Per year. 6% per year. And here is the rate at which firms that are dying are destroying jobs. So this is the rate at which they're destroyed, again, on average per year. And so Missouri here is going to rank a little bit below 5%. So we're creating jobs at a little bit faster clip by these new companies than are exiting. Okay. So and I'm trying to leave plenty of time for Q&A because I think that there's a lot that's going on here, and you guys may have questions because I still do, I know that. So let's just ask some basic questions. I showed all those series, and let's start with the first one. Is there any systematic relationship that we see? Is there something that's going on across states that we can glean from this data? So do states with faster employment growth tend to have higher number of entering firms? Again, that's a level question. So I'm going to tell you now exactly why the level doesn't matter at all. Big states are going to have lots of entering firms, lots of exiting firms. That's the message. So the answer is no. The correlation between states that have high employment growth and a large number of entering firms is that the correlation is almost zero. Same thing with exiting firms. The correlation is even smaller. Okay? So states with faster employment growth tend to have a higher number of exiting firms. So we got rid of the level stuff. Let's go to the rate stuff. So we're asking the question the wrong way by looking at levels. So let's look at rates. Get rid of the big states and small states stuff. So now I'm going to ask the question, do states with faster employment growth tend to have higher rates of entering firms? Are they creating new establishments? I said firms here. I should be saying establishments. Forgive me. The rate at which new establishments are being created, does that seem to have any correlation with how fast new employees are being added in the state economy? Here the correlation's big and positive. So states that grow faster tend to have lots of a higher entry rate for the establishments that are going on in the state. Here's what's kind of interesting though. Do states with faster employment growth tend to have higher rates of exiting firms? The answer is yes. So I'm going to get to a point here, and just bear with me. That seems counterintuitive, right? If lots of firms are exiting, you'd think that the state would be declining. Because I didn't say anything about whether there were new firms that were entering or not. This is just a simple correlation between the rate at which firms are exiting and how fast employment growth is going. So as firms exit at a faster rate in a state, those states tend to have faster employment growth.
I apologize for getting here late, but exit, does exit mean going out of business or going out of state?
No, it could be both.
Okay.
It could be both.
They're gone from
one way or another. They're gone from one way or another. But so yeah, you could see flight.
That's what I was going to ask.
So I got 2 for 1 here. So that gives me credit, right? If I get 2. Okay, so that's kind of interesting to me, I think. So let's look at the job creation numbers. Let's ask it in a slightly different way. Do states with faster employment growth tend to have higher rates of job creation? So forget whether it's a new establishment or not. You could only have one establishment coming in at a very low rate, but it's a big employer. Columbia a few years ago they did bring in IBM and tried to set up a call center. There's lots of activity in St. Louis and Kansas City where the state or the city government is trying to bring in new establishments. Bombardier a dozen years ago or 10 years ago in Kansas City. We're familiar here in this shop with when St. Louis tried to build Aerotropolis. I don't know if you remember that, but these new establishments, if they're big employers, that could be something. Well, the answer is yes. The correlation is that job creation rates from new establishments is positively correlated with with employment growth in the state. I'm going to ask it just exactly the opposite way to see if I've got some kind of robustness, if I've got some faith now in my result, that the exit rate. So what about job destruction by establishments that are dying? Again, the correlation's pretty substantial. It's almost 0.7. So we got a picture here that's starting to be painted. And this is going to be what I'm going to do in the conclusions. Births are, it's not surprising. We would expect births are going to be important for a state economy. What may be counterintuitive and what I want to leave the message with is so are deaths. So what's the bigger message here? So if there's an economist from the early 1900s, Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the term creative destruction. Or some people have modified that and now they call it the churn. The idea is that what you need in the economy for this thing to be going, for this thing to be growing, is to have both a vibrant entry and a vibrant exit to this. You don't want to maintain companies that are or establishments that are either outdated or having difficulty. You don't want to prop them up by either using tax incentives or changing your tax rates or providing some other kind of mechanism. That doesn't seem to do very well. So you want to be really careful about trying to avoid keeping the village blacksmith in a 21st century economy. And so I'm just going to close this off. I'm just going to close it off. So I just borrowed from the Beatles and I said, it looks like the best thing to be, and sort of what the mantra of the Show Me Institute would be is just let it be. Let the churn go on, and then see how fast your state's going to grow. Sir, you've got a question. No, that's a great question, and so what I can tell you is simply looking at the pattern of memory that exists in how fast establishments are entering into a state economy, there seems to be a fair bit of persistence or memory in that. So that would suggest that if we had a lot of establishments created at a fast rate last year, that rate is going to continue. So I think that's in line with what you're saying. Now, what I don't have an answer to is, and I don't have at this level, I would have to get census clearance in order to get the by firm entry characteristics. All I've got is aggregates right here. So I don't know if these are big firms that are then leading to these guys or not, but there's a lot of research that's being done at the national level with this data, kind of looking at these questions. My son is doctoral candidate in finance here at WashU, and he's telling me that the finance guys are starting to look at this data very carefully at the micro level. They're not going to ask these kinds of persistence questions, but this will come out. The answer to this question will come out. My gut says is that the big guys, attracting the big guys is not really an impetus for, because there's a cost of attracting them. And I think that's really the meta message that I want to get at. If you're attracting these companies by giving them big tax incentive packages, the state ends up losing some of its resources because it costs the state in order to get that, and it costs you and I. They're either going to make up the taxes by other mechanisms, and that's going to create fewer incentives for mom and pop shops to show up here. It is a big interwoven picture, and just saying I'm going to go.
That statement assumes that the pie is fixed.
No, it doesn't.
The pie isn't fixed.
No.
Because I give money to
No, it doesn't
Toyota,
assume that.
No, but because I give money to Toyota doesn't mean that I now have less state resources. I've just brought jobs. They're going to trigger other goods and
So
services.
I'm telling you that when you do the math, when you give a big tax incentive package to Toyota, that costs the state, that's in a given year, you're right. But over time, Toyota is not going to it's not going to induce a rate of growth that's fast enough to overcome that, even in any present value sense or even in any mechanism sense that we can talk about. So I was assuming when I said for a given year that's true, but even over time, it's hard to make up the size of those tax incentive programs. Somebody has to pay for those extra resources eventually, and what I'm also saying is that over time, that creates a negative incentive that reduces the benefit that having Toyota in place is going to generate.
Are you doing a macro measurement to include?
Of course, I'm a macro guy.
No, but to do the ancillary real estate investment and development that occurs as a result.
You can do you can count in all of these, you can take into account all of these various sectoral events that you want to, and it just can't create enough of a wash. The point is, and so here's what I'll say in a simple macro story. The multiplier is just, first of all, is not a good, that old macro model that most people learned, which was if the government spends some money, they're going to get multiple times what they're going to get. Under that calculus, of course you can generate a kind of a positive spin. That multiplier theory has been discredited. It's much smaller than what anybody ever thought, because every time you make an action, every time the government takes an action, there's an opposite reaction on the other side. Whenever they give goods and services to somebody that lower taxes for somebody else, either services are going to go down, poor schools, fewer parks, whatever you think adds to quality of life, or they're going to raise taxes on other people and redistribute that, which is going to shock them and cause them to spend less in the same town. So that opposite reaction is sometimes even results in a negative multiplier depending on how much the tax rates go up. So that's why I'd say that you can do as much of this multiplier analysis as you want. First of all, you have to be very careful about how you're doing it, because you have to take both sides of the fiscal equation into account, and then it doesn't work. So let me go over here. When you do it in a per capita sense, it changes a little, but not much. So for example, Missouri goes from 49th to 44th. If you look at per capita growth. Our population just isn't growing very much either. So it does change things a little, but not as much as you'd hoped for. Let's go over here.
Yeah.
The first thing is to just create a stable environment and not create a set where the rules are going to constantly change on a per new establishment basis. I think that's what Missouri has done more in the last 20 years than a lot of other states. So we've got some data on tax increment finance, and we know what the size of tax credits, how those have ballooned in the state.
Yeah.
That's just a version of trying to have a managed or a controlled economy.
It doesn't work.
They don't seem to work very well. So get out of the business of trying to select who the winners and losers are going to be in Missouri and see what happens. And I think that there's nothing that makes Missouri fundamentally less growth worthy than other states. And given that, I mean, I think the people here are just as clever and just as hardworking as they are in other states, but they're responding to the incentive structure that they've got, and that incentive structure is going to lead to this level of activity. That's a good question, and I think, again, if I could get into the census data, I could actually dig into that and answer your question, but right now I don't. These are aggregates. Your gut instinct is in line with mine, that what I think that you're really wanting to do is encourage risk-taking and not worrying about firms that didn't make it. You don't want to try to protect them. Protectionism is a really bad thing. I'm going to say that right now because it's a real concern about what's going to happen in the next 4 years in this country. We want to avoid protectionism. Somebody over here, and then I'll... Did you have... Yeah.
No, you answered my question
Okay.
about the impact of TIPS and tax incentives.
Yeah, I wish I could be more definitive about that, but in my... everything that works in the favorite economic model in my head, that's a bad thing. There are other ways, there are other things that they could be doing rather than spending resources and giving them to potential startup companies. That's probably not the thing that we're best at in a university. We're great at hiring engineers and physicists and chemists who come up with really cool stuff, but we're not so good at sort of saying, oh, you should have office space here at a subsidized rate. And when you're talking about $10 or $15 million, the calculation in my head is that's a lot of chemists and physicists and biochem guys that we could be hiring that could be doing really cool stuff. Now, in general, Well, you know, this is a private, I mean, there are externalities that go with this. What you're trying to do is say, I'm not a big fan of incubators. No, that's where I should leave it. I'm just not a big fan of it.
No, we don't.
Okay? I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak in any sensible way about what the psychology of growth is. I can speak as an economist. And what I understand, what drives growth rather than being a psychological factor or a mental issue at the micro level, even at the regional level, what drives growth is what are the relative return.
Macro level, the rest of the country doesn't view us as serious about growth.
And look, and all I'm going to say to that is I think that that's a reflection. So oftentimes when business people talk, what you hear is things that matter are quality of life and these kinds of soft, immeasurable things. What I would submit to you as an economist is what you begin to look at the data is that you can map that, you can take that sentence and say what it means is that the environment, the political, the social, the economic environment into which they're operating is going to offer a lower after-tax rate of return at that location compared to some other location. So I don't know about the psychology, but I think people are extraordinarily clever, and the data bears this out, extraordinarily clever in being able to assess where they're going to get the greatest rate of return, and they locate accordingly. So I should have been more clear. I'm not a big fan of the government-led incubators, but the private ones I think you got to invest. I mean, you got to subsidize risk in some sense of the word.
These are the companies that you're talking about getting started.
Yeah. Texas, Nevada. Now I sound like a Missourian. There you go. Washington State. You start to see a pattern.
There's no income tax.
Yeah, there you go. I'm looking at Mr. Sinkfield only because he and Dr. Laffer and several others have written on this as extensively as they can. So here's what's interesting. When you start to look at the metropolitan areas, so I had a paper with last summer with an undergrad from Mizzou who's now at Carnegie Mellon. So we've exported some of our best talent already. When you divide up the metropolitan areas especially the ones on the border, Kansas side of Kansas City's doing great. The Missouri part's not doing so well. So simply to lump in and say Kansas City's doing great compared to St. Louis. Now on the St. Louis side, Illinois sucks even worse than Missouri in some ways. So you don't have that dynamic that's going on that's creating this stuff. I can't get to that. Yeah, that's not reported. No, these are great things, and again, census clearance would be wonderful. Did you have something you wanted? I'm just going to submit that I think that's a little bit inverted. Skilled labor is extremely mobile. And if the opportunities and the returns are there, they tend to flow to wherever. So resources, at least labor. So buildings are harder to pick up and move from one place to another. People are pretty easy to move around. And the evidence shows that out. They're willing to move wherever they're going to get the highest return to their labor activity. So I don't think we've got a skilled labor shortage as much as we've got an underlying set of prices and returns to skilled labor that are not conducive. I don't want you guys to leave thinking that certainly we haven't solved this. I'm not saying that I've got the answers. What I'm saying is there's lots of important questions, and we need to dig into what the answers are and then formulate a sensible approach we need a model of how people are behaving. I think this is why economists are useful. At least that's what that we need to understand. We need to sort of construct a framework to understand what's going on here, rather than just saying, oh, there's a problem, let me run and try to solve it. Paternalism is a great thing. Everyone in here who is a father or could potentially be a father knows that you want to take care of your kids, and I think that mindset in state government is in some ways noble, but you can also be foolish and noble. So let's be smart and noble. Thanks a lot for coming. I appreciate it and for your insight.